In 2010, a team of geneticists sat down with genome data from 14 Jewish communities scattered across 4 continents: Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, Sephardic Jews from Spain and North Africa, Mizrahi Jews from Iraq and Iran, Jews from Yemen, from Georgia, from Ethiopia, populations separated by up to 2,000 years, different languages, different skin tones, different food, different neighbors, different empires ruling over them for centuries. On paper, they should have looked like completely different peoples. Instead, what the DNA showed made several of the researchers go back and rerun the analysis because they thought they'd made an error. The communities matched each other, not loosely, not distantly related like all humans are, tightly, genetically, as if a single population had been photocopied and scattered across the earth and every copy had kept the same watermark. So here's the question this video is going to answer. If Jewish communities have been separated for 2 millennia, living under Rome, under the Ottomans, under Christian Spain, under the Russian Empire, why does their DNA still point back to one place, one people, one moment in history? And when scientists line that DNA up against every other ancient civilization on record, Egyptian, Roman, Persian, Phoenician, Babylonian, only one population turned out to be a genetic match, not a myth, not a religious claim. A measurable, published, peer-reviewed genetic signature. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand something that even surprises geneticists. How a people can lose their homeland, their language, and their freedom, and still not lose their DNA. Let's make this real before we make it scientific. Picture a woman in Brooklyn, mid-30s, whose grandmother survived a village in Poland that no longer exists on any map. Her grandmother told her they were Jewish since always. But nobody in the family could say where always began. Was it Poland? Germany? Somewhere further back that nobody had words for anymore? She does what a lot of people do now. She spits into a tube and mails it off for a DNA test. Weeks later, the result comes back. And it doesn't say Poland. It doesn't say Germany. It says something stranger. A strong, consistent signal pointing toward the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, a region she has never visited, in a country her family hadn't lived in for at least 2,000 years. She's not alone. This exact result, European ancestry on the surface, Middle Eastern ancestry underneath, shows up again and again in Ashkenazi Jewish genetic testing. It's one of the most consistent, most reproducible findings in modern population genetics. And it raises the question that drives this entire video. How does a population keep a 2,000-year-old genetic postcard from a homeland most of them never set foot in? Let's go to the actual research, because this isn't speculation. It's one of the most cited studies in Jewish population genetics, led by geneticist Doron Behar and published in the journal Nature. His team gathered genome-wide data, hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, not just a handful, from Jewish communities in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, and compared them against non-Jewish populations from the same regions: Italians, Russians, Moroccans, Syrians, Palestinians, Druze, Bedouin. The logic was simple. If 2,000 years of living among Europeans had genetically absorbed European Jews into European populations, the DNA should show it. Ashkenazi Jews should cluster tightly with Poles and Germans. If Sephardic Jews had been absorbed into Spanish and Moroccan populations, their DNA should cluster with those groups instead. That is not what the data showed. Instead, when the computer sorted every genome by similarity with no labels attached, a blind test, the Jewish populations from wildly different countries clustered together first, before clustering with any of their non-Jewish neighbors. Yemenite Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of almost zero contact, were genetically closer to each other than either group was to the population living next door to them. Something had kept these communities distinct, and the data pointed to what that something was. Once researchers had established that Jewish populations shared a common genetic core, the next question was obvious. A core traced back to where? This is where the study, and others that followed it, pointed toward the Levant, the narrow strip of land running through modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, the ancient home of the Israelites, the Judeans, the very people the word Jewish descends from. Genetically, this shows up in a specific way. When you compare Jewish populations to modern Levantine groups, Druze communities in Lebanon and Israel, Bedouin populations, Palestinian populations, a striking overlap appears, not identical, because 2,000 years and different admixture histories separate them, but closely related in the same way that cousins share more than strangers, even after their family branches went separate ways. Here's where it gets more layered than a headline can capture, and where a lot of online claims oversimplify things. Ashkenazi Jewish DNA isn't purely Middle Eastern. There's a real, measurable European component too, largely from Southern European ancestry, likely linked to communities that formed as Jewish traders and migrants settled in Italy and the Mediterranean in the centuries after the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, before moving north and east into France, Germany, and eventually Poland and Russia. So the honest picture isn't one bloodline untouched for 2,000 years. It's a Middle Eastern founding population that picked up real, documented admixture along its migration route, but never lost the original signal underneath it. That's the part that stunned researchers. Not that the signal was pure, that it survived at all. Now let's talk about a piece of evidence that's almost too strange to be real. And it predates the big genome study by over a decade. In 1997, a geneticist named Karl Skorecki had a question rooted in Jewish tradition itself. Jewish men who carry the surname Cohen, or a variant of it, are traditionally believed to be direct patrilineal descendants of a single ancestor, the biblical Aaron, brother of Moses, first high priest of Israel, a lineage passed strictly father to son for over 3,000 years. Skorecki tested this. He looked at the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son. In Jewish men who identified as Kohanim, priestly descendants across communities that had been separated for centuries, some Ashkenazi, some Sephardic, some Mizrahi. A striking majority of these men, across totally separate, geographically distant Jewish communities, shared the same Y chromosome signature, what's now called the Cohen Modal Haplotype. Men whose ancestors hadn't spoken to each other in centuries, who had never met, who lived under different empires and spoke different languages, were carrying matching genetic fingerprints on the paternal line traced to what researchers estimate could be a common ancestor roughly 3,000 years ago, startlingly close to the traditional timeline associated with the priesthood. Whether or not you take the biblical account literally, the genetics here forced scientists to take an oral tradition seriously as a historical record, because the DNA was backing it up. No good documentary hides the counter-argument, so let's deal with it directly. Because you may have heard this one. The theory that Ashkenazi Jews descend primarily not from the ancient Levant, but from the Khazars, a Turkic empire that ruled parts of the Caucasus and southern Russia in the early Middle Ages, whose elite reportedly converted to Judaism. If true, it would mean the return to the homeland story is mostly myth, and Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry is Central Asian, not Middle Eastern. It's a real historical episode. The Khazar conversion did happen. The question is whether it explains Ashkenazi genetics at scale. When researchers actually went looking for a strong Khazar, Caucasus, or Central Asian genetic signal in Ashkenazi populations, including the Behar team, in a dedicated 2013 follow-up study, they found the opposite of what the theory predicted. No significant Caucasus region genetic contribution showed up. What kept showing up instead was the same Levantine and Southern European signal already established. The Khazar hypothesis remains a minority position in the field, not because it's forbidden to ask the question, but because when the question was actually tested against genome data, the numbers didn't support it. Science doesn't reward the most viral theory. It rewards the one that survives being checked. So now let's do what the title promised. Line Jewish genetic ancestry up against the record of every major ancient civilization researchers have usable DNA for, and see what actually matches. Ancient Egyptian mummy genomes, sequenced in 2017, show a population most closely related to ancient and modern populations of the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, but with a distinct profile of their own, shaped by the Nile corridor and later, more sub-Saharan African admixture entering after the period most mummy samples come from. It's a genetic neighbor to the Levant, not a twin. Ancient Roman period Italian genomes show heavy cosmopolitan mixing pulled from across the empire. North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, Western Europe. A genetic melting pot by design, not a stable founder population. Ancient Persian and Mesopotamian samples show a Near Eastern signature too, but shaped by a different, more easterly ancient gene pool stretching toward the Iranian Plateau and the Caucasus. Phoenician period coastal samples, some analyzed from ancient burial sites, show close genetic ties to the Levant, which makes sense since Phoenicians and ancient Israelites were geographic neighbors, likely with overlapping ancestral populations, but distinct cultural and political identities. And ancient Levantine populations themselves. The Canaanite period and Bronze Age genomes recovered from sites in modern Israel and Lebanon show the closest, most consistent genetic continuity, with modern Jewish populations of any ancient sample tested, not identical. Populations shift and mix over 3,000 years, no group stays frozen. But of every ancient civilization researchers have usable ancient DNA for, the ancient Levant, the ancestral home of the Israelites, is the one population whose genetic profile modern Jewish communities most closely, consistently trace back to. That's the only one matched. Not a headline exaggeration. A pattern that shows up study after study, method after method, from Y chromosome lineages to full genome comparisons. Here's what actually made researchers pause, though. Not the location of the match, but the fact that it survived at all. Most diaspora populations in history dissolve. They intermarry, assimilate, and within a handful of generations, their distinct genetic signature blends into the majority population around them and disappears from the record. Jewish communities, on average, did not fully. And when you ask historians why, the genetic pattern lines up almost perfectly with something non-genetic. Religious and cultural practices that discouraged intermarriage with surrounding populations, community structures that stayed largely endogamous for centuries at a time, even under pressure, even under persecution. The DNA isn't just a record of geography. It's a record of a culture that fought, generation after generation, often at enormous cost, to keep itself intact. That's not a genetic accident. That's the fingerprint of survival. So the DNA confirms what oral tradition claimed for 3,000 years. A scattered people, quietly carrying the genetic signature of one ancient homeland the entire time. But here's the question this raises that we haven't answered yet. If a persecuted, dispersed population can preserve its ancestry against those odds, what does that mean for every other lost, ancient people? Historians assumed had vanished completely, because the truth is, they might not be gone. Their DNA might just be sitting quietly in a village nobody's tested yet. That's the next investigation. Subscribe, because we're about to go looking for one.